1945 was a tumultuous year. It saw fierce fighting, peace, and the beginnings of a new world order. The Allies were determined to inflict total defeat on their enemies at any cost. But following victory, the Big Three, Britain, America, and the Soviet Union, fought each other for supremacy. The shape of the world we live in today is the legacy of events of 1945. In this program, we'll see a major upset for the Western Allies in January. How the Red Army launched the biggest military offensive in history. And how in February, British bombers took off to pulverize German cities in a series of controversial military decisions full of behind-the-scenes scheming. The previous year had seen many successful Allied advances. To the east of Germany, the Red Army rapidly recovered virtually all of the land they had lost to the Nazis. On the Western Front, the Allies had landed on the Normandy beaches on D-Day and then made fast progress through Northern Europe, right up to the borders of Germany. Paris had been liberated on the 25th of August 1944. A week later, British soldiers entered Brussels to a warm welcome, and by the start of 1945, Britain expected their leader, Churchill, to take them to a speedy victory in Europe.
Of course, to people following the news in the papers, the breakout from Normandy, the advance towards the Rhine, the liberation of Paris, all these things did happen after a certain point so quickly that it looked as if everything would be rolled out by the end of 1944. But those in charge, Churchill and his commanders-in-chief and his war cabinet, knew that, in fact, the Germans intended to fight every inch of the way.
The Allies destroy the German armies in the west, and then there's this extraordinary period of rapid advance right up almost to the Rhine and the border of Germany, and everyone thinks the war will be over by Christmas. Well, of course it isn't.
Far from giving up, in total secrecy, Hitler planned a counterattack. This took the Allies completely by surprise. In the depths of one of the worst winters on record, Hitler amassed 200,000 men on the Belgian border, hidden in the thickly forested Ardennes area. On the 16th of December 1944, they launched their attack on 83,000 unsuspecting American troops. What became known as the Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last desperate attempt to avert defeat.
If anyone has said the Germans are going to assemble 250,000 men and 1,000 tanks for a surprise offensive in the West, people said they're mad. And yet that's exactly what Hitler does. In the winter snow, with cloud cover, so there's no air activity by the Allied side, he bursts something like 25 divisions on, I think, 5 unsuspecting American divisions and almost breaks through. And his aim is to try and get up to the ports, up towards Antwerp, and split the British and Americans.
The Germans took 25,000 prisoners. American troops heard that the Nazis were shooting and torturing captives. One of the Allied soldiers was Curtis Whiteway.
I carefully crawled up to the scouts as they pointed ahead in the trees. One of our guys was hanging in the tree, spread eagle standing upright. He was twitching and his arms and legs were tied to nearby trees. He was totally nude and the Germans had taken some kind of torch. They burned his eyes out. He was still alive. One of the men behind me cried out, "Put him out of his misery." I realized that this was a warning to us. Don't come any further into Germany, or this will happen to you.
The Germans succeeded in driving a bulge straight through the Allies' front line. A counter-offensive was launched. General Eisenhower, in command of the European operations, put the American General Bradley and Britain's Montgomery in charge of beating back the Germans.
Eisenhower stands back and he says to Montgomery, you handle all the armies, including the American armies, to the north, And he said to Bradley in the south, you handle all the American armies in the south, and Eisenhower's coolness and ability to delegate down to these two heavyweights, and these two are heavyweights, actually is what crushes the German offensive, that and lack of fuel.
Casualties were high on both sides. Nearly 100,000 Germans and 80,000 Americans were killed, missing or injured. This was the most costly battle the Americans had fought in northwestern Europe. By mid-January 1945, the Germans had been forced to withdraw from the Ardennes completely. The consequences of this battle stalled the Allies' advance into Germany and delayed the end of the war in Europe.
Part of the shock of the Ardennes offensive is not just the psychological shock of being attacked by an enemy you think is defeated, but it's also the heavy casualties, and the logistic build-up for the push into Germany for 1945 is completely disrupted.
American confidence had been severely bruised by that experience. After January 1945, they were determined to move very cautiously. The Bulge offensive had slowed up the Western Allies while making it easier for the Russians to drive much faster and harder into Germany.
By mid-January, Northern Europe was in ruins. The Western Allies put their plans to invade Germany on hold. But in the Soviet Union, tanks poured off the production lines so that Stalin could launch a major new offensive on the Eastern Front.
The Russians were poised to launch their huge offensive, and vast armies had been massed. So the Russians had had 4 or 5 months of building up their forces because they had big difficulties. There wasn't anything like the road network or rail network that there was in the West. And every inch of the way they had to build railways and restore roads to move supplies forward to enable their millions of men to launch the offensive. So the Germans knew that they were approaching the last act.
For 2 long years, the Red Army had fought the Germans in the Soviet Union. As they began to reclaim their homeland, the true horror of the Nazi occupation slowly dawned on them. In Kiev, they found that hundreds of civilians had been killed by the fleeing Germans.
As Soviet troops moved very fast, they came across even worse scenes of bestial behavior, and this convinced Soviet troops, if they weren't already convinced, that they were facing an enemy that had behaved in an utterly inhuman fashion. They didn't regard the Germans as fellow members of the human race, and they themselves carried out a campaign of pillage and rape that was pretty disgraceful.
Many Soviet soldiers have been encouraged to keep revenge diaries through the past few years by their political officers, in which they wrote down the terrible things they'd seen the Germans do in Russia so that they could extract revenge and enter it in their revenge ledger.
On the 12th of January, in freezing cold weather, the Red Army started a massive new offensive towards Germany through Poland. It began on the Ukrainian front. Two days later, General Zhukov led the main push from the Belarusian front. The Soviet Union succeeded in mobilizing a massive force of over 6 million men, an amazing feat. By the 19th of January, they had taken the Polish capital, Warsaw. Fleeing Germans had destroyed much of the city. 3/4 of the buildings were in ruins. Then, on the 27th of January, the Red Army entered Auschwitz. The real horror of what they'd found did not become widely known until the war in Europe was over. Meanwhile, the Red Army continued its relentless advance on Germany.
One of the paradoxes about the Red Army was that it was an extraordinary mixture of the most savage discipline and the most ferocious indiscipline. That I remember meeting a Soviet tank officer called Kudrashov, who told me a story about his driver, who was a completely illiterate Tatar, who one night he'd been left on watch and fell asleep. And Kudryashov woke him up and said, "It's a firing squad for you." And he didn't mean it, but his driver knew very well that if Kudryashov reported him, it probably would be the firing squad, and the man fell helpless on his knees. And the next day, the driver came to Kudryashov and he said, would he write a letter home for him? Because he couldn't write himself. And Kudryashov said, yes. He said, I'll write a letter home saying how you fell asleep on watch last night. And again, the driver fell on his knees in terror, because he said, say anything you like, say anything, but don't do it.
The poor driver was killed in action 2 days later. At tremendous cost, the Soviet Union now occupied large parts of Eastern Europe, but Churchill was worried by this turn of events.
Churchill hoped to bring Stalin to a conference before the Red Army was in any one of the Eastern European capitals, so that they could discuss the future of Eastern Europe with no force majeure of Soviet tanks being in every capital. And he pleaded with Stalin and Roosevelt, let's have our conference now. And Stalin, cannily and understandably from his perspective, said no. Churchill even, the conference was going to be held in Jerusalem, and Stalin said, I can't fly, my doctors say I can't fly. So Churchill sent him the railway timetable. In those days, you could take a train.
But Stalin was an intensely suspicious man, and he thought that at any time Roosevelt or Churchill might play a trick on him, might gang up on him, just as he would do to them if he possibly could. He loved to play Roosevelt off against Churchill and vice versa.
Churchill felt very much that the borders of post-war Europe would be determined where the armies met. His fear was that communism, which was advancing with the Red Army steadily, would essentially advance to the Atlantic.
By the end of January, the Allies had Germany surrounded, but still Hitler wouldn't give up. The Nazis wanted to fight to the bitter end, and the war in Europe was far from over. By the end of January 1945, the Americans were making headway in the Pacific against the Japanese. They had won a major sea battle, capturing the strategically important island of Leyte in the Philippines. But the outcome of the Pacific War was still far from certain. In Europe, by the end of January, the Western Allies were moving towards northern Germany, waiting for the big push. Worried about the size of potential casualties, the Americans wanted reinforcements to be fully prepared for the onslaught. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army had made astonishing advances and had reached the River Oder just 45 miles from Berlin. But Stalin was also forced to pause. They faced ferocious German resistance, and their supply line was stretched to the limit. They had no choice but to wait for more troops.
Stalin's army was a fighting force such as the world had never before seen. It was an extraordinary blend of the sophisticated and the technological with the barbaric. In front went punishment battalions. They were units composed of people who'd committed either political or disciplinary offences and who were simply thrown ruthlessly at the enemy as cannon fodder, either to clear minefields or just to test the enemy's fire. And then you've got the Guards divisions behind. The Guards divisions were mostly formations such as Western armies might just about recognise. They had some pretty educated, sophisticated people in them, and they were given the best of the equipment. And then behind them in turn, you had this great mass of more or less brutes, mostly from the Soviet Asian Republic.
As the Soviet army pushed onwards, they were fired up with revenge, hatred, and a lust to punish the supporters of Nazism. Rape was commonplace. As they entered the Hungarian capital, Budapest, a young Jewish girl was hiding in a cellar.
When liberation came, it was the Mongolians, not the White Russian we would expect it to come. They were rough and uncultured, using beautiful books for toilet paper and heating fuel. Of course, the first thing they wanted were women. The first time it happened, they burst into the cellar where I was hiding with two sisters, who I later discovered were baronesses. I will never forget the look on the poor girls' faces as the Russians grabbed them and marched them away to be raped outside, never inside. They were only 14 or 15. Thank God I only looked about 10, if that. I must have been too small and skinny after 3 weeks of literal starvation. Though beastly in many ways, they were specifically on the front line to do the dirty work.
We have to face the fact that the Western Allies needed the barbarians, the soldiers of Stalin, in order to defeat Hitler's tyranny. That if we look at this in the most brutal terms, in the course of the Second World War, American and British ground troops killed about 200,000 Germans. That's in the desert, in Italy and Northwest Europe. The Soviets killed about 3.5 million. So, although, yes, one can take pride in the fact that the Western Allies maintained their civilized values, they needed the savages in order to bring down Hitler.
The West was worried about the Red Army's excesses, but publicly newsreels showed the gratitude of local people liberated by the advancing soldiers.
I'm sure that Stalin would have been aware of Churchill's concerns about the treatment of people in the territories being occupied in the East, but frankly there was nothing Churchill could do about it. The British and Americans were still a long way away in the West. The Red Army was advancing at extraordinary speed. And in the Vistula-Oder operation, starting in January 1945, they traversed hundreds of kilometers. The Germans were pulling back very fast because, of course, they realized that they were going to have to defend Germany itself.
Stalin was determined that that movement would be as fast and as deep as possible. He saw that the more territory he conquered, the stronger would be his bargaining position at the next conference that would have to be arranged. So he had a much more acute anticipation of the political consequences of the military campaign than was the case of Roosevelt.
When one looks at Roosevelt's foreign policy, what comes out is a desire to constrain Germany, to make Germany realize she'd lost the war, but not to make her so weak that you have a vacuum of power in Europe that the Soviet can just walk over.
Initially, Russia's aspirations, of course, was simply to survive. But when it became apparent that they were going to win the war, then the prospect of overwhelming Germany and dominating Eastern and Central Europe came to the fore.
But towards the end of January, the Germans were still a formidable fighting force, and they constantly refused the Allies' demand for unconditional surrender.
One of the reasons the Germans resist so strongly, both here and in the East, is because of the doctrine of unconditional surrender, which Roosevelt has thrown on the table. But if you're fighting for your homeland and the invaders at the gates, you're going to fight to the last.
They were fighting with the fanaticism of despair, and especially this was true of the very young. This was Goebbels' triumph, that here he had a whole generation of young Germans who'd spent 12 years indoctrinated into Nazism, into a belief that the Third Reich mattered more than life itself. And many Allied soldiers have said that they found one of the worst aspects of this last phase was fighting the children. A 13-year-old with a rifle could kill you as dead as any adult.
German morale was buoyed up by a belief that new weapons would turn the tide of the war.
By early 45, the Germans can thump V2s into Antwerp and on the Rhine bridges and places like that, but everyone knows they're never going to alter the outcome of the war.
amazingly, despite the Allied strategic bombing, which had been massive and continuous and effective, despite that, the Germans were still manufacturing secret weaponry. I mean, Hitler always called his secret weapons, the first being, of course, the V-bombs, and then these terrifying rocket bombs, which were being produced long after the Normandy landings. So even when the Allies were ashore in Western Europe, or on land in Western Europe, these things were raining down on London and raining down on Antwerp and denying us, of course, a port.
This bombardment by V1 and V2s had seriously dented the morale of the British people. The first V1s were launched in June 1944. One devastated the Guards' Chapel near Buckingham Palace, killing 121 people. The faster and more deadly V2s started to rain down in September 1944 and into 1945. By the end of the war, they had killed over 2,500 Londoners.
Hitler's secret weapons, they'd been expected throughout the war, and then they came. And of course the government was very cagey about revealing information about what they were and denied the effect of them. And of course that is always, in public opinion terms, in morale terms, that's always an absolute disaster. And I think there was a feeling of complete desperation because they were pilots' planes. They seemed more sinister than the bombers. And I think the deaths from the B-2s, I mean, things like the Smithfield disaster or the V1s, the Guards' Chapel, were quite devastating to people, even if the statistics weren't necessarily let out.
We had a shelter in the basement, but if we ran to the shelter every time an air raid siren went off, we'd never get any work done. So we'd stay where we were on the 4th floor while the planes came over and the bombs dropped. And then we'd be told, best to run downstairs now, and so we'd go, just in time. I remember the V1 and V2 rockets. I remember looking out of my window and seeing Euston Station go up. A direct hit with a rocket, thousands of pieces of white paper fluttering up in the air.
Other secret weapons were on their way, including long-distance submarines, which would enable them to go to the coast of the United States without surfacing, without refueling. So Churchill knew, and the people at the very top knew, this is not going to be a pushover, there's not going to be a sudden surrender.
At the end of January, the Americans continued to make progress in the Pacific. They were preparing for an advance on Manila, the capital of the Philippines. But Japanese resistance was strong, so they realized defeating Japan would be costly. They would need the formidable Red Army to beat Japan. After the break, we'll see how this ended up costing Eastern Europe its freedom. At the start of February 1945, the Allied powers were marshalling their forces for the final assault on Germany. The Germans had fought back fiercely, but the outcome of the war was by now in no doubt. It was just a matter of time. The Red Army's final advance on Berlin had paused, but further east it continued to take over German territory in East Prussia. This land had hardly been touched by war. Its population lived in relative comfort. This was in stark contrast to the privations of the Red Army. And when they saw this, their soldiers looted, raped, and killed civilians on a massive scale. The resulting flood of refugees is one of the biggest single migrations ever. Over 8 million people fled before the advancing Red Army, and many were killed trying to get away. The German generals bravely held open a corridor for their exit, defying Hitler's orders and risking execution.
One of the most extraordinary took place in East Prussia, near the Baltic, in January, February, March 45, when in 4 feet of snow and temperatures 25 below zero, the Soviets were smashing their way into East Prussia, driving more than 1 million civilians before them, men, women, children with their carts and their prams and their barrows, struggling through the snows for survival. And as the Soviets swept into East Prussia, that finally there was only one escape route left across a frozen lagoon, the Frischeshafen, beside the Baltic. And tens of thousands of people were struggling across this with Russian shells falling, smashing holes in the ice, and carts and screaming people falling into it, and scenes of terrible horror. And the German army in those days fought some very gallant actions to keep open that last path into Germany for the refugees from East Prussia.
By the beginning of 1945, it was absolutely essential for the big three to get together, to deal with each other, not through diplomats, but directly. Stalin, as usual, refused to travel abroad, and down in Crimea there were all the old palaces of the Tsars. He could show off.
So Roosevelt and Churchill travelled to the seaside town of Yalta. At previous conferences, they had agreed on the establishment of the United Nations, German reparations to the Soviet Union, and the division of Germany. But each leader had a very different agenda, and each engaged in secret and separate talks when they got to Yalta.
This tension in the three-part relationship is something that the three leaders tried not to let show publicly, but were very aware of privately.
If Great Britain goes down, the Axis powers will control the continents of Europe and Asia and Africa and Australasia and the high seas.
I think the basic question is, how did Churchill see Britain's role now that the United States was playing a major part in securing the victory and when the Soviet Union was making the largest contribution in terms of manpower? He understood that, he accepted that. He fought every day to make sure that the British didn't get shortchanged in terms of what they were doing.
Certainly, Roosevelt's developing the idea that the USSR is perhaps not quite as friendly towards the rest as it might be. And this is curious because for a good part of the war, Roosevelt saw the USSR as friendly, or at least as someone the US could work with. And his perception of the post-war world as not precisely a condominium, but as a world in which the US and the USSR would have some sort of overview. Now, what this does, of course, is deal out the United Kingdom.
Churchill did not trust Stalin, but he didn't know that Roosevelt was also maneuvering behind his back. This double dealing was most obvious in the case of Poland. The British had gone to war over Poland, which now lay in ruins. The exiled Polish government wanted to return, but Churchill knew Stalin had designs on their country. So he wanted to walk away from Yalta with agreement that the Poles would have free elections.
The Yalta agenda was dominated by Poland, where Stalin became, as the official records say, very affable, very friendly. There was a moment when both Churchill and Roosevelt rather nervously sort of asked Stalin, free elections in Poland. Yes, said Stalin. And they thought, well, he can agree to free elections, but when will they be? So they said, can we have them within the year? And Stalin said, why not have them, within 6 months? Why not? Why wait? So, of course, Stalin was posing as being on the side of the angels.
But in reality, Roosevelt was prepared to abandon Poland. The three leaders agreed that at some future date, Poland's borders would move west into Germany, and Stalin would gain territory which suited his political goals.
And for Stalin, security came through having a territorial buffer between himself and Germany. And he found Roosevelt and Churchill were willing to grant him this. Now, why did they make that decision? In early 1945, it looked as if an even more severe war would still have to be fought in the Far East. And the Western Allies badly wanted Stalin to agree, once the war had been won in Europe, to turn his Red Army and put it at the disposal of the alliance against Japan.
In the Pacific, the Americans had won an important naval victory at Leyte, and by the 6th of February, during the Yalta Conference, they had recaptured the Philippine capital Manila. But a new disturbing phenomenon had emerged during these battles. suicide or kamikaze pilots attacked the American fleet in large numbers and inflicted heavy damage. It was still not clear who would win in the Pacific. The atom bomb remained untested, and the Americans thought they needed the help of the Red Army. This was to seal Poland's fate at Yalta.
The problem for Churchill at Yalta was the American side. But what Churchill didn't know was that Roosevelt had already been negotiating with Stalin on all sorts of elements of the war against Japan. Roosevelt already had a secret agreement with Stalin for American planes bombing Japan to use Siberian air bases. And therefore Roosevelt did not want to pick a quarrel over anything, certainly not over Poland, about which Roosevelt was actually quite cynical. He makes, in the original Yalta transcripts, Roosevelt makes very cynical remarks about the Poles and about the Poles in America, and, they have no influence on me, and, who cares about them? In other words, he didn't have the Churchillian or the British commitment to the Poles as a people in their country, Poland.
As a result, Poland became part of the empire of the Soviet Union, under the heel of Stalin's tyranny.
In recent years, there's been a lot of criticism of Yalta as a supposed betrayal by the Western Allies, and in particular by Roosevelt, because he had the power in a way that Churchill did not. The bald fact was, the Soviets had got there first. To put it bluntly, unless the Western Allies were prepared to fight, to go to war with the Soviets, to save Eastern Europe, which nobody was in 1945 for a moment, the fact was that Stalin had got these countries physically in his grasp.
When the exiled Polish government returned, it was greeted by Stalin's troops and arrested. Free elections were quickly forgotten.
Stalin's attitude was perfectly simple. Stalin said, in Western Europe, those who liberated these countries have imposed the systems of government that they saw appropriate. We think a different system is appropriate. We have liberated the East. We will decide what governments govern in the East.
However, at Yalta, the big three leaders did agree on how they would run Germany.
The first thing was that there should be zones of occupation in Germany. And here Churchill had a very strong dispute with Roosevelt. The Americans didn't want the French to participate in these zones of occupation, and Churchill insisted that they should. And so, as a result of really quite a long fight, as it were, behind the scenes at Yalta between the British and Americans, the French got their zone of occupation.
The Allied powers also agreed at Yalta how the United Nations should be structured, making the Soviet Union, China, the United States, and Britain the most powerful members of it.
This is when the structure of the United Nations was agreed. Negotiations, give and take, came up with an organization that each of the great powers could live with.
Agreement on the long-term future proved easier than on short-term military strategy. While their troops showed fraternal comradeship, the leaders each had their own eyes on Berlin, when Nazism was finally to die. On the 19th of February, the Americans started an offensive onto Japanese territory and landed on the strategically important island of Iwo Jima. The Japanese immediately put them under heavy fire. The Americans lost 4,000 men in the first 2 days. Then, for the next month, they advanced slowly across the island. The Japanese were prepared to die in their thousands, and out of a total force of 23,000, all but 216 died, defending what they saw as their sacred land. In Europe, the Germans were also battling to the last. They were fighting local resistance movements street by street. The Allies had yet to advance into the heart of Germany itself.
In the minds of the Western Allies, like their Eastern brethren, Berlin, Hitler's capital, the heart of the Third Reich, was always the symbolic target. The Western Allies, in all their plans and all their conversations, always talked as if Berlin was going to be where they'd end up. And when, for example, representatives of the Dutch, who were suffering terribly under German occupation, were starving in thousands, and the Dutch begged that a few divisions could be diverted to liberate Holland before going on into Germany. And Allied commanders always gave the same answer. They said the best service we can render to all the oppressed peoples of Europe is to get on to Berlin, to end the Nazi tyranny, and then everyone will be free.
To make the Dutch people's lives more desperate and miserable, the Germans flooded acres of land, including fields that could provide them with food. The Dutch daily food ration had fallen to starvation levels. Living in Rotterdam was Anna.
It was bitterly cold and we were all starving. If we could find tulip bulbs, we'd roast them in an old dustbin. We had a bicycle with no tyres. My older two sisters and my father would go east of the city in desperate search of food. We hoped the farmers just might have something. But the nasty Germans would stop them on the way back and confiscate any food they'd found for themselves.
The plight of the Dutch did not go entirely ignored, and food was eventually parachuted in. All over Europe, people were starving, but the Western Allies refused to be diverted from getting to Berlin and trying to keep Poland as part of the West.
It meant that if the Allies could reach Berlin and 100 miles beyond, the Allies and Poland would be contiguous, and therefore Polish independence could be secured. What happened was that Stalin, of course, knew this. He knew the Allied plans. We communicated our plans to him. And so he came to a private arrangement with Eisenhower, which is most extraordinary. And we now have the whole correspondence between Churchill and Eisenhower about it, that Stalin said to Eisenhower, Berlin is no longer important. All the German ministries have moved or are moving south to Leipzig, Chemnitz, Dresden, south. So why don't you advance your armies south, right, and leave Berlin to us, because that's not important. Well, the moment Churchill learned of this, which he did by accident, but by the accident of seeing the armies going in a different direction to what he'd expected, he said, what is this? And Eisenhower said, no, the Soviets say Berlin's not important. And Churchill saw the trap immediately, and Churchill said, but wait a minute, even if all the ministries have left Berlin, which I don't believe because it wasn't true, still Berlin has a psychological importance. Berlin is the German capital. Berlin is where Hitler is.
By now, Hitler had no faith in his military advisors, and as defeat was inevitable, his decision-making became increasingly irrational. He wasted limited German resources on developing secret weapons. Addicted to painkillers and holed up in his bunker, he became deeply paranoid.
He's demented. He's obviously got terrific physical problems. His health is broken, and he's completely lost trust in the general staff and the army. He's acting as his own military commander, and he's become fanatical. For example, he appoints Himmler, of all people, as the commander of the defences of Berlin. Who's quite useless. He's a Nazi party functioning politician, completely the wrong man. But he doesn't trust the army, and really, by this time, Hitler knows the game's up, and he's determined to bring the German people down with him.
The most blameworthy were Germany's generals, who, whatever their military genius, and many of them did possess military genius, they failed their nation and the world because they were the only people who both knew that Germany was losing the war, knew what the Nazis had done, and had the power to do something about it.
As the Allied forces moved through the ruins of Europe, they faced defeated and injured Germans. But many Red Army soldiers were so brutalized that they showed little or no mercy to their enemy. The Germans often fared better at the hands of the Western invaders.
The vast majority of Western Allied soldiers weren't natural killers. They felt miserably unhappy about fighting among villages and towns that looked pretty much like their own villages and towns. And a story always sticks in my mind of a British tank officer who as they were advancing into Germany, on the edge of a forest he saw movement, and he saw vehicles moving around, and they swiveled the turret and fired several rounds of high explosive, and then put a couple of bursts of machine gun fire there. And then he said, to his horror, he saw through his binoculars that the people on the edge of the forest weren't German soldiers, they were civilians. And two small figures detached themselves from the wreckage of the carts and the vehicles that they'd shot up and walked towards the thing, and one of them, their children, and they stood and looked up at the turret of his tank, and a little boy, about 10, says in English to the British officer, "You have just killed my father." And the British officer wrote in his diary, "There was nothing I could say."
One event more than any other highlighted the ambiguous attitude the British had towards German civilians: the bombing of Dresden. On the 13th of February, 244 RAF bombers dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs on the city, killing 35,000 civilians. The strategic value of the relentless bombing campaign of German cities is the source of vehement disagreement to this day. Among those who think that we shouldn't judge the past by the standards of the present is John Hughes Wilson.
One of the great controversies that's come out of the Second World War is the bombing of German cities. We've really rather agonised about this after the war. That's desperately unfair, and it's revisionist history of the worst kind, because you can't alter what things were like at the time.
People's view, I think, on the bombing of the saturation bombing of Dresden was very mixed. I mean, on the whole, I think there was not the gung-ho attitude that there was in the popular press, the Daily Mail and the Daily Express. There wasn't that. There was a feeling, I think, well, we've had it, why shouldn't they? But I don't think there was this sort of very strong feeling of revenge. I think also there was a degree of apathy. I think people were just so kind of exhausted about their ability, in a sense, to be shocked had somewhat diminished by that time.
Other historians like Max Hastings take the view that at the time it was known that there was little strategic value to this bombing.
More bombs were dropped on Germany in this last phase when the Nazi defences had more or less collapsed and the Allied air forces had reached the zenith of their power than in the whole of the rest of the war put together. And when you say, what did destroying Dresden and Halle, Leipzig, all those other cities contribute to the end of the war, the answer is virtually nothing.
Dresden is the best known German city which was carpet bombed. It is now also known that it was the one city that the Soviet Union specifically asked to be attacked in order to stop German troop movement.
The Soviets knew that some 15 first-class German divisions were moving away from northern Italy, from Central Europe, from Norway, to go against the Russian Eastern Front. And the Soviets were desperate to have Dresden and Leipzig pulverized so that this massive movement of armor wouldn't take place.
The next day, United States Air Force Mustangs, the fighters, come along, and machine gun survivors in the parks. You don't often hear that, but it's a fact as the United States Air Force follow up. So this isn't just a British problem, it's a problem of the whole bombing strategy.
Why in 1945 did they go on bombing cities? The RAF go on bombing cities. And I'm afraid the answer has to be twofold. One, technological fanaticism had sort of taken over, that the fact that you've got this huge bomber force which existed, and you could hardly tell it to do nothing when the Germans were still fighting furiously. And the whole thing had achieved a dynamic momentum of its own. And secondly, because Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, the commander of Bomber Command, had become completely personally obsessed with completing the destruction of Germany's cities before the war ended.
One of the most shameful things of the Second World War is the way that Churchill, who has launched this bombing offensive and written warmly to Harris to congratulate him on bombing out German cities, by the time March has come around, he actually retracts and writes a really quite disgraceful memorandum to the chiefs of the air staff saying, I don't think we should do this, and it's nothing to do with me, Gov, and has to retract. And he's doing that because suddenly he realises perhaps the airmen have gone too far for public conscience, but the airmen have only done what the Prime Minister requested and indeed applauded them.
But Churchill was not thinking much about bombing by that stage. In 1940 and 41, he devoted a huge amount of energy and attention to bombing because it was the only way of attacking the Nazis. But by 1944-45, his mind was focused on what the land armies were doing in the future of post-war Europe. In his memoirs, he scarcely mentions bombing in the last volume or two.
There are two distinctly different views on the Allied bombing campaign of German cities, but everyone agrees that by 1945 the war had numbed people to its horrors.
What we're actually seeing here is, if you like, the ratchet effect of war. What in 1939 would have been unthinkable. By 1945 it's become a commonplace. The Second World War shows the ratchet effect of desensitisation of human feeling and human psychology. And it's the involvement of civilians that ratchets up the casualties and makes the point the Second World War is a total war.